All right.
Mhm.
So we're going to watch some stories, some that I think have some interesting anecdotes, as well as what the stories are about. Can be worthy of discussion around ethics, but also the workshop itself, and how the story presents itself. Right, so ethics is all over the place, and as you'll see in our approach and the sort of 6 main areas of ethics we talk about. It's everything from facilitation to content to distribution and everything in between. So it's a rich area, and it should never be taken up. Well, I don't think anyone here would even disagree with that lightly in the work. But let's start with this story. This one we lead off with this session, and I don't think, Janet, sometimes we do contextualize it. What do you think? Should we just play it?
I think we should let it stand on its own, I
Okay.
think. And then, if we need to fill in context as people need it to make sense of it, then, but let's see how it lands on everyone.
Can you see it? It wouldn't allow me to play it in Google, so I've got it on YouTube. Can you see it? Or are we still
Yep.
looking at my
We
slides?
can see, no, we can see it. Participant observation. Yep.
All right.
Nice.
I was supposed to be an observer. When I first came to the Kalasha Valleys in northern Pakistan to conduct PhD dissertation research on Kalasha women's culture, I was stunned by the din and buzz of daily life in this small pastoral place. I taped it on my state-of-the-art cassette recorder, thinking no one would believe me otherwise. But when I came home 2 years later and played it to astonish my friends and colleagues, I didn't hear chaotic noise anymore. I heard the very particular words and voices of individual men, women, and children who had become real to me. Even though I was especially interested in observing their bishali, the communal menstrual house where women went when they were menstruating and to give birth, I'd never actually held a newborn before. I waited anxiously for the birth of Talim Khan and Nana's child. When the time came, together with the midwife, we walked the half-mile up valley to the bishali in the middle of the night, our way lit by little torches of resin-soaked wood. The birth was quick. The baby boy was big and healthy. The midwife cut the cord, swaddled him up, and then made a special sweet cream-of-wheat porridge for Talim Khan and Nana. All night we bishali women, even me, took turns holding the baby around the fire while his mother slept. Talim Khan and Nana said I was his aunt, and said I should have a baby girl, and then we would marry our children, and we'd be cultivar. I documented the many rituals and visitations that happen in babies' first weeks of life, as they are blessed and welcomed into the community. Then, about a week after mother and child came home, he got sick. With the help of my now worn copy of Where There Is No Doctor, I decided that he had pneumonia. A penicillin shot would likely cure him, the book said. Boys from the neighborhood raced to find the only young man in the valley with keys to the dispensary, but he had gone to the high pastures and was several hours away. The other women from Chetguru took turns walking around with the baby. But sometimes I was the one holding him. And in between his heaving breaths, he was so still, so blue. "Look," I said, "let's take him to Chitral. There's a jeep in the bazaar. Let's go." But Talim Khan and Nana said she wanted to wait for her husband to come home. Surely he would come home soon, and then he would come with me to take the baby. I said we should go now. I said I would pay for the jeep. I would pay for the hospital. She said, "Surely he'll come. Let's wait." I was 26, just married, didn't have kids, didn't even know how to bake a cake. But I realized that I could have taken that baby, with or without his mother, and gone to Chitral. She would have let me. They all would have let me. But I didn't. Instead, I sat outside on the ground and held the baby, as the other women, one by one, went home to tend to their own children. One last huge gasp for breath ended in stillness. I don't remember what happened exactly after that, but someone took the dead baby from me and sent me home. I didn't write about this, or the funeral that followed, or even the birth in any of my work. I finished my dissertation, published a book, but after my daughters were born, I never went back to the field.
Let's take a pause, maybe make some sort of notes to self, and then maybe we'll open up the discussion. Well, we will open the discussion, about what you saw, you heard, impacts, but also thinking it just without even going through our guidelines, the ethical practices, and this is not to put any association to win. And I mean, she just made a story in a public digital storytelling workshop. So there will be there's a little writing exercise after this, and we'll get to that, which will have a couple of questions to lead you in that. But I think for now, just to kind of where it landed for you, what your thoughts about participant observation.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody want to lead us in?
I can go.
Sure.
Yeah, so connected with this video on a few different fronts. As a clinician, and she's trying to diagnose, understand what's going on with the baby, but also as a researcher and doing participant observation or studying something or a people, right, a community. And so first of all, I would say that she remarks at the end that she didn't reveal any of the birth or the death or the funeral in her published book, but she attended a public workshop to tell this story. So it makes me wonder if she is finally healing from that, especially after you can tell that she's had her children, she's had some children, she's had daughters, a piece to that puzzle of being connected to this family and this community in one way. And I am wondering what happened for her that she was finally able to tell this story right now. Why now? What were events that led up to this? Was this cathartic for her? Was this healing for her? And then personally, I'd really want to know, because she alludes to the fact that now she realizes that she could have just taken the baby and gotten care, but what prevented her in those moments when she was in the community, that what was going on? Yeah, that was really, because I could see that there's like a lot of things going on, a lot of dynamic. It sounds it's very, very rural, but still, that seems to be the thing that she struggles with the most, is that she recognizes that decision and she didn't take action, and maybe she regrets that.
Right. Yeah, I can give you some background to why she told that story and how it came about in the public workshop. I hadn't heard, we've played this story a lot, but that's the first time I've seen it. She didn't go public in her publication, but she did go public, so to speak, because it's got 35,000 views, through a lot of it through our exposure through our trainings. And so that's, I hadn't ever made that connection with it. She did publish about this event and what transpired. So I can give a little bit about the workshop dynamic and how it came about. But let's just keep the conversation. Great points. Thanks.
Thanks.
First,
It was an amazing story. She did some beautiful things visually. I actually took some notes on some of the techniques that she used. To me, this is part and parcel of the dilemma for anthropologists, You are supposed to be going in, and she does say at the beginning, I'm going in as an observer. And so to me, her decision not to go back into the field, at least for me, was she can't go in as an anthropologist anymore. She, after this experience, I mean, she did the responsible thing. She did the thing that she's supposed to do as an anthropologist, which is to not impact the community as she would were she to have taken that child and rushed off to the hospital. I can only imagine the dilemma, the moral dilemma, that she had to go through within herself. So anyway, I think for me it was a beautiful, complete, well, almost complete story, because like Janelle, I'm also curious as to why this moment, why this time, what made her ready to be able to tell this story. And yeah, again, Janelle, I agree. Sort of like I hoping or assuming that this means she's healed. She's going through healing, having had the courage to tell this story.
Can I just add that to Corinne, that, you know, one could also argue two things. One could also argue that in a very Western lens, right, anthropology, which comes from that worldview, that yes, you have to be, you have to take yourself out of the equation. That, but at the same time, she is enjoying and participating in the community as a community member, right? And it's hard to tell if, you know, how women's status in this community. So it's hard to tell she seems like she's single, like a young single woman in this community. If there are other ramifications of why she didn't take the baby and go solo, right? Or if it was keeping herself with that she was feeling pulled, and her role was as participant, observer, to see what would happen, to document it, to think about it. But I would say that the images and what she has shown, the progression, that she was participating in the community. And so you know, as a community member, the mother of the child is waiting for her husband to come home. Like, she's not going to leave until her husband comes. So does that mean that, you know, like that women's status, like she wouldn't be able to do that? But there's this part of her as an American, I'm assuming she's American, that she's this independence of like, I have money, I can do this, we can go. But the other side of it is that I guess that the aside from the requirements of true anthropology, if that's what she was really practicing, if that's what she was trying to do, I wonder if a part of it is that she felt as a community member and had the power to make a change, and she didn't do that, if that was like a big issue. So and the fact that she didn't tell anyone, you know, some anthropologists would be like, and then this death happened, and then we did this burial, and I got to say the burial rites, right? And she didn't do that. That also kind of speaks volume of like that story that she didn't tell publicly until now. It is so interesting, like so many questions, right?
Michelle or Rachel? All good.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Beautiful discussion.
Yeah, and I was also just thinking, you know, that the power dynamic there, and if she had just taken the baby and taken the car that was in town, and, you know, God forbid the baby dies on the way, or the baby dies at the hospital, and, you know, the community is then looking at her as this outsider who, you know, I mean, it has 100 layers there, you know, or that she takes the baby and the baby gets the treatment and miraculously survives, and then they're looking at her, you know, as someone who can solve problems that she can't. You know what I mean? It's so tragic for the family, and it just seems like it reminds me a lot in some ways of Corinne's story, you know, that she's an outsider and she's hearing what's
Mhm.
happening there.
Mhm.
And a lot of us, at least a lot of people I know in the West, we do have a can-do spirit of, oh my God, let's fix this. Let's go. Let's do something. And I'm sure that there's good and bad to that, and it's complex. So I remember seeing that story, I think in my first workshop. It affected me then, and it affected me again this time. But thank you for sharing
Thanks, Michelle.
it again.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right. Rachel,
Okay.
not to just, I mean, if you can put them in the chat, or maybe you say, I agree, or what, your thoughts, anything come to mind? Have you seen the story before?
You know, it seemed familiar, but at the same time, I was just watching it and I'm like, I feel like I've seen this, but I'm not sure. I think I just was enjoying listening to the discussion because that story, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, what do I make of this story? Um, as someone who's, you know, in her 20s, and I'm like, what would I do in that situation? And you know, someone also just like I'm thinking about my own kind of what Robbie was saying about that activity, but my own biases and how heavily I rely on Western medicine and I wouldn't be here without it. And I'm just like, I don't want to say anything because I'm just like, oh my gosh, what a hard place she was in. And to share that story, to not share that story, I mean, that's traumatic I feel like for all involved. And um, so I was interested in just hearing the discussion among you guys and what you made of that story. And it made a lot of sense to me what you all were saying. But I don't know how to make heads or tails of it. I just know that my heart is heavy after hearing that story.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I think that's why I was a little quiet because I'm like, I don't, you know, I heard it and I'm listening and I'm processing, and it's sad. It's sad, but
Yeah.
at the same time, it's a different culture, and you have to respect that as well. So yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it's sad. It's a very sad story. Well, at least, you know, the circumstances around it. Jenny, you've seen this now. We keep showing this one. Anything
Yeah.
new for you that's popped up?
Yeah,
Or
well, it's popping up because I'm kind of trying to distill what I'm hearing from everyone. So now, interestingly, I've never heard the kind of anthropologist identity piece, and I'm not verifying anthropology, but to me, it's an example of the way in which we step into identities and make assumptions about what our role in that identity is, even though some of the behaviors associated with that identity might be humanly impossible, in particular context, because they're kind of dreamt up and created in another world, in another space, and we kind of migrate them out into the world, and we expect that they're sustainable. I wrote in the 2 seconds ago, I've been a teacher since I'm 20. What does that mean? I mean, really, really, what does that mean across cultures and across geopolitical situations? Does it really translate as the same thing everywhere I go? No, think not. Think not. And so even as digital storytellers, we're really asking ourselves, what is our identity here? What's our role in this context? What's the context we're sitting in? And that's what I heard in a lot of the discussions so far. How does that context shape role? Thank you, guys. Woo.
Yeah, yeah.
You
I didn't
guys are
think
amazing.
that little discussion about how we identify through our working lives, but that again, I hadn't really thought about it in the way you just expressed it, sort of piggybacking off Janelle and the conversation. I think
that was earlier. Yeah. I am this. I do this. This is my role. These are the ethics that go with that role. Are they that airtight? Are they that transferable across context? And what attention do we need to give to context? And how do we mediate that?
Mhm.
Yeah. There were two other things that stand out that,
Sure.
it
Mhm.
comes down to that personal conflict. Obviously, she has personal conflict, whatever is going on, roles as an anthropologist or as an observer
Mhm.
and outside into this community, her role as a female, as a single female, person that she said. So one of the things is as she's telling that difficult part of the story, there's that reduction choice that she made in the visual reduction of her. I think that's her.
Yep.
I'm
Yeah.
not
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
her,
Yeah.
right? She reduced herself, and I want to know why she did that. Like, what does that mean to
Yeah.
her? Because she could have done a pan, like, or a zoom in, or a pan out. Like, she could have done a number of things, but why a reduction? And then the other piece,
Hmm.
she admits that the women would have been fine. She interprets that looking back that the woman would have been fine had she taken the baby, regardless of whatever role she has in that community in that moment, right? And so again, it goes back to that personal conflict that she has around that experience. It's a very fascinating, very thought-provoking piece for sure. Very, very much.
Yeah.
And it's why in some ways, just like Medea, in a particular way, although it got into, we started talking a little bit about ethics about, as it turns out, she wasn't from, the communities and the landscapes, the geopolitical landscapes of those, right, in the second story. So, created like, whose story is this and for what purpose and all that. So let's get just a bit of context. So it was a public workshop in Denver. I wasn't teaching it, but I do know that she came in, I don't know if she had even a story to tell. I think she was thinking about telling us something about being a mother, or, just coming. So I don't know exactly if she had a story or it was going to be about being an anthropologist, whatever the story circle. But I think initially she was telling a different story. But, and I don't even know where she was in the lineup of going through the circle. So she told this story, right? So whatever she was, and there's an interesting dynamic when you go around a room, who goes first and what impact, how does that set up the others? Do they follow suit? Do they, right? So again, these are all things that you have to be aware of. So she told a story she's going to do, and it was not this one. And then she said, or I could tell you this, I've never spoken about this. So there's that sort of going public. So, I'm just assuming here, again, it's assumption that because other people may be talking difficult stories, hers, for maybe her first story, I think it was not something about an experience that was sort of like, that had to be resurfaced. It was, and she broke down and everybody let her have a moment. And then she told essentially, what the story was, this other story about, not the writing part of it. So, and so it's without her here, what compelled her to leave the story she had, maybe through the feedback that she was getting, saying, hey, where are you in the story? Who knows? I could see that happening, telling a story that maybe you're a little bit elevated outside of the experience. And plus maybe 2 or 3 people have gone and told about some things in their lives that they had overcome, or, you can, like the stories you've seen it already, that she had something changed. And she said, or there's this story. I would say probably unprescribed and not ready to, didn't have it in the wings. It just came. So that's that, as far as I know. But I think the take home from facilitation is that the story circle has a ripple effect. Or it potentially has one, maybe not. Maybe some people are oblivious. Some people will go, well, there's no way I'm gonna go into that deep, and they do tell a superficial story. And then there's, how much of as a facilitation do you keep going, working something to see if they have anything beyond the sort of veneer, and when do you let go? In a public workshop, it's probably a little different than in a workshop that there's. But there's some agreement, however, in the sort of sense in the the sort of guidelines about why people are in that room to tell stories about, their time when they're an anthropologist and things didn't go according to plan. You can imagine that, which that story probably might have come out in a more thematically driven workshop. So that's that part. So I don't know if that's just for some information. It was made a while ago. But what I just think, because there's been a lot of questions, it raises a lot of questions, it kicks things up. And here we are talking about it and there's nothing resolved. And in some cases, we don't really know, right, what's the right way to approach this. It's just a series of questions. So I'm not saying good or bad. It tells me that digital stories don't necessarily resolve things, and they don't necessarily bring clarity. We've shown this in different, depending on the makeup of the DSOCP. It's being showed at conferences, and some things, there's some common threads about questions and curiosities, and then it raises some really strong reactions, right, depending on the context, right? And everybody was being very gentle here, but they can raise, and again, Maggie's not here, it's kind of unfair, but it does raise ethical considerations of how she tells the story, not just what the story is about, but how she tells it. Does anybody see that there may be some, and again, dare I use the word problems, but did any flags raised for you in how she told the story, the structure of it, the visuals? And this is, again, there's no right or wrong. I'm not saying if you didn't see it, that doesn't mean that you missed out on something. But knowing that this story has come into play in different places and has been sort of attacked, taken to task around some of the visuals, some of the writing structure, the structure of the story. And again, context matters. In a workshop where we're here sort of discussing it to learn facilitation, but in a workshop maybe about stories about trauma, or amongst anthropologists or whatever, it'll have a different landing. Anything in this story that strikes you? Michelle, go ahead.
This to me is not a criticism, but of course we never see the community or the mother's reaction to the loss of the baby. And I didn't know if anybody else noticed that. And of course the story was about her role as an outsider and an observer. So that made perfect sense to me. It's not a criticism, but once the baby dies, the community is sort of missing from that piece.
The title is strange, Participant Observation. So again, I don't know, maybe, I don't know what in the teaching of anthropology, if that's, the outsider has come up. I think everybody has sort of touched on that sort of outsider. Of course, there are times in the story by her dress, by even include us, she even says, us Bashali women, which included me or something, but she said the us, so she had the collective in there. I don't know if that was just not picked up, but there she is, at least through the garments and the women, there is this sort of sense of you are part of the community, but you're not. And I think there is another story or two or three to tell here, which is, what she doesn't do is what is going on inside of her when she's having that. So it is after the fact, in reflection. I didn't go back into the field, I'm a mother, but the story would be much different about what the turmoil she was going in that moment. And that's a completely different story. And in some ways is the story that's missing it. And that's not, again, in the workshop of environment or how do you probe, because I don't think it was necessarily a pub workshop to probe into there. But that to me is the sort of a dilemma with this story that talks about something that's sad and tragic, but we really don't in my opinion, get what really was going on with the person telling the story.
Yeah, I think, Rob, my suspicion, I don't know what year this story was done in, but my suspicion
About
is
10
that
years
the
ago.
story predates the current kind of reluctant acceptance of autoethnography, which is, as the storyteller, as the anthropologist, as the narrator, you need to locate yourself and the history of the identity that you bring into the reaction, and to be as explicit about it as possible. I am so and so with this background, carrying this legacy, which is likely to cloud my lens in the following way. And there's a way of being as explicit as one possibly can about it. And I hear in your comments, Rob, what part of it might have been helpful to have that in the story. I mean, autoethnography is just being recognized as being valid and not strange, so social practice or social inquiry practice with people who just, want to get all subjective and use their imagination. We're scientists, we're not subjective, we're all objective. We've gone past that. So I suspect that's part of it. On the other side, I'm also really cautious from an adult education lens about the confessional. And the way in which the confessional has entered the learning arena. I can't learn anything. I can't absorb until I tell you my entire history from here, the bits that I want to expose, I don't want to expose, whether I feel vulnerable or not. If you are leading the workshop, you feel that it is your, I don't know, territory, right? Whatever, to kind of milk every single story for as much kind of vulnerability and explicit divulgence as you can. And, I'm going all the way back. Oh, lady, I am going all the way back to 80s and Foucault and the whole thing about the confessional being another form of tyranny. And I think we really need to be thinking about these things. You talked about it, Rob, when people are going around, and sometimes you can see what I call the oppression Olympics stepping in. I told one story about oppression, my story about oppression, it's gonna be bigger than yours, and the next one's gonna be even big. What's really happening here? Is this the story you really want to tell for this workshop? And how do you what do you want to share in this context? You don't have to leave your whole stomach on the carpet. It's not required for a good digital story. You can choose arenas in which you want to share and what you want to share. But when you're engaging with other people's lives as a researcher, if you keep all your stuff, but you got all their stuff, what's happening there? So it's kind of, to me, being reflective and mindful about these things. Not that you're going to get it right every time, but recognizing that there are these things that you can think about, reflect on, journal about. So you get some kind of clarity over where you want to position yourself in a process. That's my 2 cents. Sorry. I didn't mean to preach. I didn't mean to preach. Fine. Sorry. I feel strongly about this, you can tell.
No, Janet, what you're sharing is exactly what has been going on in academia, and the issue of locating yourself in the work. And like 20 years ago, I remember that was what I was reading in grad school, was how we shouldn't be bracketing ourselves, that as researchers, we bring ourselves into this space, and the very question that we have is a version of us, right? We have influenced the very question by even speaking it out loud. So when we go and we observe, or we participate, or whatever we're doing, we have already brought ourselves there, and now we can't bracket or take away ourselves. We have to be involved in it, right? And so that is the same alignment I was thinking in her work. And the title, Participant Observation, a little ironic. Was she really doing it? Was she, like that struggle? And then going back to what Rob was talking about in terms of like space for these stories where, in this case for Maggie, or I'm sorry, that's her last name.
Yes, yeah, Wynn.
That this was the story that was told, although it may have been kind of lurking for years, but it finally came out in this workshop. And I've only been to one other workshop with Story Center, and it was 10 years ago or so. I too had the experience of being in a public workshop in Berkeley, and the one of the facilitators, someone who's been there for a very long time, saw the story that I was planning to work on, and it was a story that came out in that story circle piece where I changed at the last moment because it wasn't the story that needed to be told. And the story that actually needed to be told was one that was healing for me. And it didn't have a resolution really, like it was, but it was something that was very much me. And being told that maybe I should think of not having the story in this place because it's bothersome, it's deep, it's traumatic. And maybe I might enjoy, a better, I might enjoy telling the story in a different space. And that was, it was off-putting, but I understood. I totally understood, because I know that when we tell these deep stories, it can be very uncomfortable. So I know this person was worried about what others were thinking, what other, participants would have been thinking about. But then again, that was 10 years ago, as we are now here 10 years later, knowing that it very much matters to hear these stories, to understand there's worldviews and experiences, because you have to understand that in order to live in this community of the world, right? So I'm very much interested in healing stories, and I can see that probably the work that I'm probably going to be more drawn to are going to be those stories where the healing comes from being able to tell those stories.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Couple of things, and then we'll go to the questions, and maybe we can write into that space a bit, and then take a break, and maybe write while we're taking a break. So a couple of things I wrote down, and I don't know the facility. Oh, it was me, all learning.
I don't think it was you.
No, I don't. It doesn't make. Again, we will get into this when because there's anecdotes. The whole thing about learning is being in the ethical, sort of the humility and the humbleness that is needed, especially when you're out, as a facilitator, you can be outside your element in all sorts of, you can just imagine, right? Just look at me, right? I'm sitting here as a male among 5 females. I mean, talk about participant observation, right? And I don't want to get, you can just, so there's all sorts of dynamics in play when you have a group of people. So the group dynamic you saw to Janelle, and maybe there's, right. But here's a couple of things to think about, which is, I'm going back to how the story's told and what may be the facilitation, this idea of fingerprints. Because usually what I try to do is, like, if the storyteller, even if they move, so with Janelle and your story that felt, being comfortable in the space, and the story that was sort of coming up, the healing story, the story that maybe initially wasn't there, is I sometimes will just sort of say, because you're there people are there as a storyteller, right? Because if we're there as I'd be remiss to say I'm there as your therapist. But if I'm there as your, facilitator of a story you want to tell, and how to help you tell it, in whatever way you want to use the facilitator in that room, or the other people in that room for that matter, are all part of the group process. Is I always it's a kind of a default a bit, but what is it you want to let people know? What is that? Going back to insight and emotion, like this is, and this is where I think this isn't all I've tried to watch Win Maggie's. I go, what is she trying to tell me, or anybody? What is she trying to tell me, that she never went back to the field? Because that's the last line. It's a very catchy last line, but it kind of like all that was to say that. And that's the thing, not to say I want the story about, but I'm left not just wanting, I don't know what to do with that story. I don't know how to move in the world with that story. I don't know how to be in the world differently with that story. And I think that to me is always something as a facilitator, I'm always trying to make the storyteller understand that whatever their story, it's a gift, that they're leaving something, that's what a storyteller to me, I think we have to think about as the giver. What are you giving? And is it about like, you know, the sort of difference between Western medicine and this, or anthropology and observation? It's all up to conjecture, and it doesn't provide insight. It just does not. You know, I get a little look at the land. It's like, I can imagine there's a lot of children that die at birth or close, right? In rural, oppressed, don't have the services. But even having an anthropologist there didn't, or, Western person didn't save that child's life. And is that something to say we need to be saving lives? All of these things are insights. So, and they're big insights and they can be little insights. But my default as a facilitator is to get the storyteller to think, why am I telling this story? And, I think even somebody wrote that, I wrote down. Yeah, I think Janelle wrote, even again, just why is she telling this? Why did she tell the story in that moment? But even deeper, why is she telling that story? For what end? And again, she's not here, and she might have a rationale. I just don't get it. I see the sadness, I see the ethical dilemma, but I don't know how to take what that experience that she had, that she's trying to tell me something. And all I can tell is like, she was uncomfortable writing about it, and she never went back to the field, but she never says why. We just have to assume that we know. Jan, I don't know if that's, so I'm not actually, right? Does that make sense? That's just, as a facilitator, I'm just trying to find ways for people to ground themselves and say, and at least what they're knowing. And if they say, I really don't know. So what I'm trying to tell people is, it's a scary world out there, and there's more mistakes to be made than not. That's all insight. But this one it does not leave me with anything to take forward and think about how I would be. And I have a similar story, sort of. And I haven't told it because I'm not sure why I'm telling it. Is it to sort of like, hey, I had this experience, or have I really learned something that I think is important for an audience to hear a perspective?
Agree, Rob. That last question, have I really learned something? That's the question at the bottom of the well.
Yeah. Here's something to take to the break, and maybe I'm going to sort of smash up the break a little bit with these questions, if that's okay. And I didn't want to sort of end on that note, but I wanted to steer it back to a sort of this idea of the facilitation again. We can sort of pick away at the story and what it's about and how it impacts us. And I'm not there, I think it was Daniel Weinschenker. I don't want to, I think that was the workshop. We all have a particular style on how we want people to move through a process to get to a piece of writing that has a beginning, middle, and an end, right? And then we structure that, all part of the process. A digital story, arguably one that is watchable and is intriguing and creates this sort of, not exotic, because that would be unfair, but a glimpse into rural Nepal. And there's language and words and names that are right. And then there's this picture with a director's chair. All of these things have impact. And I have heard from people that the visuals are problematic, that chair is problematic, the title is problematic. And Wynn's not, that's unfair to saddle her with that burden of it can't fit all things for all people. But as a facilitator, the more I can understand, where the story, and we'll get into that, where is the story landing? And it doesn't, you don't have to overthink that, but it's just always in the back of a facilitator's head, right? In some ways, protecting the storyteller as best you can, right? Anyway, going to my slides, and I'm here going to put the little, yes, there's a chair. It looks like a director's chair. So while you're taking a break, oopsie, I'm sorry. Why does it not escape? Here's a little writing prompt and see if we can
Comment
dig in.
in the chat.
Yeah. Oh, it is.
Felt like the storyteller's conclusion was that she could no longer be in the field because just being an observer was too painful.
So yeah, that's could very likely be. So you've had, right? So again, you can't control how people take what they take away. So Michelle, that's a wonderful, and I'm not trying to belittle that. And if Maggie's here, yeah, that's exactly it. That's the first time I actually had that meaning from someone who didn't tell the story, how they interpret it and take it. And now I have, at least from you, a way to look at that story. So, well, yeah, so let's just, here's the, I did it twice. Here's the little writing prompt. I'm going to ruminate on these questions as you write to this. And I'm going to do the same, and we'll see if people feel comfortable writing about a mistake. What does it feel like to write about a mistake? And I'm not saying when Maggie had a mistake, maybe it's not quite the right setup for this, but there are situations where, incidences have consequences. So maybe just give yourself, while you're taking a break, we'll come back at 1:15 and see if anyone wants to share what they've written. So a little extra time on the break for a little bit of writing, a little bit of reprieve. I'm going to think about I'm going to go back to the chat. So and let's come back at 1:15, top of the hour. I'll be here if anyone has any questions.
Okay.
couple of minutes and then we'll reconvene. All right. I just recommend Corinne put a couple of questions in the chat, and it's an interesting. Let's hold those. Maybe they will come up when we review some of the guidelines and but those two questions about questions to ask as a facilitator, or at least where you position yourself as a facilitator in supporting people making certain decisions, like what to say and what do you want people to what's the what meaning. The only I would say the difference is what you want to say, that they'll I want to say this. Meaning is a trickier in the sense that you can't manage, the more what you say will maybe determine closer to the meaning you want, right? But you can never control, I don't think anyways. And meaning making is, communication is a relationship to, at least if it's the one person, in the relationship, you're trying to, I want you need to know this. And then they'll go, however they respond to that, they bring in their own perspectives and make meaning out of that. But you can sort of, meaning is different than insight. I think that's the one thing. I think I wouldn't use, it's like, what are you trying to say?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And why are you trying to say it? Like, for what? Right. Because I want people to walk away with a better sense of their own role in observation. That's not meaning, that's sort of like some kind of intentionality. And I think whether again, I think intention is a different, maybe it's a little different than meaning, intentionality. All right.
Just to,
yeah, go ahead, since I'm
sorry. It's just asking those two questions has sometimes helped people to figure out what it is that they want to put out there to the world.
Sure.
To say, oh, well, actually, this is what I want to say, or this is what I want to say. But that's what I want them to go away with. So sometimes they're two different things for that person, which then kind of helps them to figure out, okay, well, then how do you want to, what is it that you want to present here?
Right.
Do you want to go with what do you want to say? And can you do that in a way where people are going to go away with that? Or is it something different? So just kind of looking at it from sort of the two sides of the coin, sometimes helps people to figure it out.
So maybe there's the question, what do you want to say? And then how you say it will sort of, how you say it is the way that, at least help navigate how people receive it. Right. So that's, I definitely see that they're not the same thing. One is easier to sort of facilitate. What do you want to say? Say it. And the guarantee of that's gonna, the meaning making, the intention like with Maggie's, again, we don't know the intention, but it created as many questions as it did resolutions. All right, so who feels like sharing, just to see how we process difficult situations or mistakes in this case? And again, knowing writing prompts and can be fraught, but curious how people responded to this idea of, a misstep that you had to make right. How do you tell that story? Anyone write to it? Or would speak to it? Maybe they just want to recount it without the writing.
I can go.
Thanks, Janelle.
Sure. So, like how when you give a friend an unexpected ride and you hadn't cleaned your car and you're like, don't judge me. Feel like
I said that the other day to my daughter's friend. Exactly that. So
I feel
embarrassed.
like this is one of those moments. Okay. Late Monday afternoon, I woke earlier than usual following an intense night shift full of supermoon baby births. Exhausted, I stumbled out of bed. It was quiet, not a good sign. Where were they? Normally there is a low monotone of bickering. I dressed and hurried downstairs looking for my kids. The living room was spotless. The backyard was deserted. I ran to the front of the house, swung open the door, and met dry heat. Too hot for kids. I stepped back. I heard laughter. I opened the guest bedroom door and saw my 2 girls sprawled on the bed, eating a bowl each full of cookies, crumbs everywhere, backpacks splayed on the carpet, water bottles on the teak end tables, and horror of all horrors, they were hovered around a laptop screen watching YouTube. I lost it. I saw red. My voice rose and I bellowed, "What are you doing, you little shits? This is unacceptable. Get this shit out of here. Clean up. No YouTube. You know better." It went on, worse for another 30 seconds, and I stomped around. When I took a breath, I saw my girls. My bravest, usually indifferent, was tearing up. My oldest and most sensitive actually shrank back and inward with huge doe eyes. I stepped back, turned away, and ran upstairs. I took deep breaths, tried to remember what that damn Think Like a Monk book had said about mindfulness and meditation. It wasn't working. I went downstairs, ate some chocolate, instantly felt better. Later that night, before going back to work, I pulled each aside and apologized. I admitted to being a monster in those moments, and I asked them what was going on. Why the cookies in bed? Why YouTube? I overreacted. Sometimes that monster is hard to prevent, to settle down, to work with, but I'm trying.
Now that's a story I can relate to.
That's great. That's great.
Thanks, Janelle.
Mm-hmm.
How was it? Well, let's just talk after that. Anyone else have some writing that they want to share, or or just off the cuff?
Okay. Anybody else? Nobody had notes on anything, any descriptions or anything?
I'll recount one.
Oh, good. And after you, Rob, I'll go.
Okay, well, you go ahead, Jen. I didn't know if I thought you were
okay.
facilitating. Yeah, go
No,
ahead.
both. So I didn't write fully, but I have notes. It was back in the early 1980s when a disc jockey and I got on the public radio and declared that Bob Marley was dead, and he was not dead. And we continued for the entire day to play records and make commentary and suspend all the programs because the king of reggae had passed away. He was not dead yet. He was not going to die for another 6 months or so. And the following day, we had to kind of discover an error had been made. We had to climb down the following day and apologize, etc. But these situations are never straightforward. A lot of what was happening was that reggae, Bermuda was very conservative back in the 1980s, and there were no reggae records allowed on the radio, no Rastafarians allowed to walk up and down. So we were kind of maybe taking liberties using the death as a way of doing things that had been forbidden politically, etc., etc. And I mean, for me, yes, we had to apologize the next day, but what the incident, this is way back in the 1980s, left me with is the whole issue of intention. Why do we do things? Why do we get engaged with things? Why are we drawn to things? I mean, for us, I think it was a lot about ego and breaking rules, etc. Yes, of course we were upset or sad at what we thought we had as information, but because of the context we were in, then it was an act of rebellion, etc., etc. Nobody paused to really scrutinize the information that we had because we had other agendas. We're going to be in everybody's face for the entire day. And to me, it's one of those life lessons that you walk away from that makes you kind of stop and question and be thorough and get information right and correct, knowing the danger of errors, and also intention. Intention. And I think the quote I ended up writing was in Murder in the Cathedral, Thomas Becket says, the fourth temptation is the worst of all. To do the right thing for the wrong reason. And it was an instance where we were doing allegedly the right thing for the very wrong reason.
Well, that's a good segue to mine. It will be a facilitation, and it will be where I was thinking I was in my element, but I wasn't. So I was doing a workshop with the Native American Health in Oakland. There was, the office there, and it was an urban youth, and most of them Navajo. And Tommy Orange was my facilitator, but I was leading it. Right? Tommy worked there, but he was sort of in the support role, but I was leading the digital storytelling workshop. And I distinctly remember when I was setting up and the youth came in, and some knew him, and the way they recruited, some were family, and it's a little clump of people that knew each other. It was interesting that they were mostly urban Navajo. Probably a lot of them hadn't never lived on the reservation. But I remember one of the teenagers watching, oh, he's so old. So right away, I have to prove my right. So I know subconsciously I went, okay, hey, I'm here and I hear you. But so in the facility, I showed a story, and it was a story I'd helped facilitate by the 17-year-old up in northern Canada, which are the Dene, which is and the Navajo is the Dina. It's the same root language. And I kind of knew all this, right? I mean, does that make me an expert? No, but I knew a little, I knew some trivia. I knew something. And so when I said Dene, one of the teenage girls, 14 or 15, says it's Dina. She said it differently. I said, yeah. It's like up there, they say this. And it was all innocuous, at least, kind of an exchange of knowledge. You can tell I'm embellishing because I'm going to something. And off, the story, and did the 7 steps or whatever version, and then we broke for lunch. And the director that was there, I can't remember her name now, called me into her office and scolded me vociferously, and I was like aghast, like I didn't know what I had done. And she and so I came out like feeling battered and bruised, right? And says, "Don't ever do that again." I'm like, "What did I?" It's like she never couldn't. But I know I had crossed a line somewhere. But there was a spiritual leader there, and I can't remember her name either. But she was a slightly, not an elder per se, but someone that was there in that space to create safety and a place to go to. And she pulled me aside, and I was like, "How you?" And she was really, she says, "How you doing?" I said, "Nah, not so good. I'm still trying to figure out." She said, "Well," he says, that's not it wasn't your role to educate. It just, and I was like, and I went, right. I'm just there to facilitate digital storytelling. I'm not there to like, to like exchange in knowledge exchange, whatever. And it was clear to me that not intentionally, I crossed a line, and I was no longer a facilitator. I was a participant in knowledge sharing that was beyond digital storytelling. Like, how do you make a cross dissolve, and how do you cross all that? It was huge, right? Because I'd worked up there. I had been in community. So those, right, you don't forget those, and you might remake the mistake, but not quite the same way. But I'm very aware, and it's a good segue into the sort of, right, to how that difficult that can be. You're there first and foremost as a digital, now depending on how you're invited in to be the expert in the room, and there are certain places that I have expertise. If it was a workshop with oil rig workers, I could at least be in some kind of community around, something that was right. That's a little different. So that was huge. And so it's a segue into the slides. And let me just see if this is the right ones. Come on. Where are you, slides?
I kind of resonate with your account, not taking away from your story, but
That's okay.
For that day at the station, I was the resident West Indian in Bermuda, where they don't like West Indians and treat them very badly because they're migrant workers. So this was the moment.
Somehow my slide deck has completely gone missing, so I'm gonna have to call it back up. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that awful music from the South that we don't want played up here.
So sometimes, the sort of humility of let me see if I can share that again. Is first and foremost, I didn't have the safety of those youth in my sites. That it created an unsafe situation. It created a power dynamic. The director of the health center wasn't very good. She was so mad that it took someone that was a little bit calmer and had a different role to play rather than the strict director. Right. So that's my story, and I tell that often because it doesn't necessarily just because it wasn't just because it was an indigenous group that I wasn't a member of. It can be in any number of places where I'm not of that group. Public workshops a little different, but even then, it has its own dynamic because there's multiple identities in that room, and the safest thing is don't assume any identity other than how can I help you, and here's some things I know about digital storytelling. So here they are: protect and enhance storyteller well-being. I failed to do that. Even it might seem like, wow, come on, get over that, right? No. If you think you can peel back the layers of the onions of, how many times that I can only imagine in school situations where that teacher's like, no, it's not how you say it. You say it this way, or, a completely different, worldview and knowledge. And I'm aware of that. And I was aware of it beforehand, but you still step in the doo-doo, which is the difference between I was not culturally humble or with humility, but I had competency. I knew the difference between pronunciation and spelling of Dena and Dinna, and I knew it was the Athabascan root, which is all westernized knowledge around something. So I was competent in a very, what I thought was a broad, but not very deep. And certainly, and I didn't do it with any bravado, but it was the wrong thing. And there's other things, right? And maybe I'm thinking this isn't cultural. Let's moving to Janelle, your experience, protect and enhance storyteller well-being. There's this, like, if you see if a story is going somewhere and, it could be two things. I don't have the competency in, dealing with triggers and trauma. So if those workshops are around that, they're, having that expertise in the room, that knows and can recognize signs rather than just, many years of practicing digital storytelling, can start to see signs, but that doesn't necessarily, I'm competent, but I'm not an expert. Nobody is in digital storytelling, in that capacity. So again, without knowing fully but even the word, and I don't think you would enjoy, if that was the quote, it's the wrong thing to say. It's not for this digital storytelling facilitator to assume what it is they don't want to do to get out of it. But there is a conversation there, and that's usually those are situations that have to be handled, in the coffee breaks. Hey, your story, how you feeling? I've got some concerns as a facilitator, and I want to make sure you're feeling safe. Let's see how it goes. Also, there's all sorts of ways to keep it, right? So there's that. Understanding consent as a process, not as a one-time event. So, and these are in custom workshops, so maybe everybody's there to agree to tell stories about a significant issue. That's how the funding or the record, the grant was written. That's how they were, quote unquote, recruited into the process. And they say, sure. And then through the process, something, they do to tell the story that's they weren't intending to tell. And it's something that maybe they don't want to share, right? And so they might pull out to tell that story and change their story midstream, or they still make it and not share it. So consent is not a one-time event. Always be ready in the projects. Now, this might go against, the IRBs and the academic institutions in those worlds where once you're committed, it's now the knowledge of that institution. And those are we've talked about those. The tensions between existing ethical guidelines with organizations, mission statements, institutions, and something called a digital storytelling workshop. And I think everyone at Story Center would say, when in our workshops, that the consent, the safety, the guidelines that we've all the agreed upon guidelines of that group in that moment supersede anything above, and certainly the consent and the guidelines of a cultural group, a community, a kind of collective, supersede anything from some institution. That's at least where we position ourselves, and then negotiation can happen. Have clarity about knowledge, production, and ownership. And if you got any questions, please put them in the chat, we'll address them. So, this is, the knowledge is of the storyteller. It's who, what they bring, and that they can choose that idea of sharing their insights, their knowledge, their moments. And so, of course, all the way through, the decisions they're made, right? First and foremost, are theirs, and the ownership is theirs. And it's up to them to decide what support they need and how much input they want from the facilitator. And there's ways, just how can I help? What would be helpful? Well, what do you think of my story? It's like, I love it. This part, I'm confused with when Maggie's, I'm not sure what you're trying to tell me. And they're like, I'm not trying to tell you anything. Okay. End of discussion. I'm trying to tell you this. And I can say, well, I heard this, or I didn't get that. Is there any way you would tell me differently so I would understand that? Well, I could say this, try that. So there's a conversation, right? But it comes from their own sense of asking questions and directing the conversation, not the other way around. Ensure local relevance. Tommy Orange was in that room. He wasn't there. He wasn't working for Story Center at the time. He was sort of the media person, made media for the Native American Health Center. But I assumed the relevance in that knowledge. So where you can, you want the representation of who's leading in the room, who's the one that is the sort of the leader overall, as you try your best to, that person is recognized in the room as someone that they can go to. And as it turns out, Tommy was that person. There was the one that they confided in, and the stories came through their relationship with Tommy, not with me. And I assumed a different role, which was like making sure that lunch was served and coffee was made and the equipment was set up. And that once I established that, they would then say, how do you do a transition? How do you do a Zoom? Right. And so it shifted the dynamic, and that worked out well. Understanding ethical decision-making as an ongoing activity. That's that again, that idea of is organic, and what you decide upon in group agreements the day before, maybe there's something has arisen and you didn't catch that in the first agreements. You have to kind of rethink those a bit. I've seen it where a workshop I did, a project, and they had gotten their ethical approval for their research project out of the institution. And then they changed the process from photo voice to digital storytelling. And that made the academic institution say, okay, you have to go through a full ethic review again, which was going to delay, and the community is ready to go. And so it was wonderful for me to observe as 3 members from the community, leaders in that community, came to the ethical hearing in that university. And that was the ace up the sleeve for Yvonne. Janelle, you got her book, and she talks about that, I think, in her book. It was a really powerful moment, that decision making, just because it's written in stone by some kind of higher authority, that there's always somewhere even higher. And distribution, which is huge, the idea of sharing, which in the 7 elements is probably the most important one anyways, at least from an ethical standpoint. What is it that you want to share? How do you share it? Can you say this? Does it feel good for you to say this? Show this, right? The idea of sharing is at the heart of sort of an ethical decision-making for the storyteller. I have to be concerned about my family, my loved ones, how I represent my neighborhood, my colleagues, right? Those are all ethical in the story creation. And then of course in the distribution, here we are looking at Win Maggie's. She's granted permission for us to use it. I don't know if she knows the extent of how it's used in ethical discussion. She might say, I'm tired of you doing that. And maybe it's up to us to say, your story gets a lot of feedback around this, but maybe she'd be up for the conversation. So that's them laid out. There's a bunch of, right, if I was right, I just went through them very quickly. But before I look at a story, is there any questions that those 6? Let me put them back up. We want to dig in a bit, or they're not clear, or where you practice them and you see where you've had your own realities to it. Yeah, Janelle was responding to that, my sort of anecdote around competency versus humility. There again, that insight, right? Having that differentiation, right? What they're bringing in. So I didn't have a sense. There was no free workshop. Here are these kids. Here's as we know it from the health center. Here's what they're dealing with, right? Now, is that on the health centers, right? For me, it's like I could ask questions, and again, the more you can set up and be aware as a facilitator about your participants
Mhm.
and what the project goals and outcomes and what, from a storyteller's perspective, what's been discussed ahead of time.
Mhm.
How have they been recruited? What's their intentions being there as 15-year-olds, you know, 15-year-old with a younger brother and sister. Also, there was 3 in the same family, different parents. It was different fathers, I should say, but they were still family, and they were part of that workshop group. So they had their own little group. All of that I was not really aware of, and I didn't think it was as important as it obviously was.
Mhm.
So that's that cultural humility. And it doesn't have to be big C culture. It's the culture of that room, the makeup in that room. You have to sort of kind of help figure it out. Guidelines are one thing, but not necessarily the right. And it's always best to err by holding back a bit until you see there's a situation that is asked of you. Let's watch a story, since there's, and maybe this is all just needs to, you know, people are still sitting on stuff. Let's just watch a story. Where is it? There it is. This was done in a project, so there's a little intro and outro. So there's a way of contextualizing it. So all these stories by people that work in trauma-informed practice are speaking to where they do their work and telling they're not trying to define trauma-informed practice, but they're telling stories about where they rub up against it and some of the things that they have to deal with, and where they position themselves to it.
We all have a story that we tell ourselves. It can be a story of pain, love, joy, hope, sorrow, or even fantasy. The concept of the story doesn't matter because it's our story. It's true to us. It's real. Others can see and hear what they want, but in our story, we are the stars. We have value. We have worth. We take center stage. I've learned a lot about storytelling from my time at Ride and Road. I hear the stories that the residents tell themselves. I cringe at the stories that I hear from those who are housed, the nearby business owners, and the dog park goers. They tell stories, but their stories come from a distance. They tell stories about the homeless people they want to avoid. They drive by fast. They turn their heads and avert their eyes. They tell themselves, if I can't see them, they aren't really there. They tell stories that aren't true. They complain about unsightly garbage, both human and physical, that must be endured on the way to somewhere else, a place where all is well and their story prevails, the perfect fairy tale. I know the story of Ride and Road, at least partially. I am continually learning it. I know those who live there now, who once had vibrant lives with futures full of hope. I've listened to their stories. I can see the person behind the stigma and shame of homelessness. Ride and Road, no longer the graveyard of dreams, taker of life, now a place of possibility, a starting point for reimagining what it means to belong in community.
you just see the outro, and it just had all the sort of credits of the project. Mindful of time. Different, again, story about someone that's in, participant observer, has a role to play with that homeless encampment on Ryden Road. But it has a different feel. Some of the things to know, sometimes these stories, in that case, it was determined not to have what was done virtually. So recorded in Zoom, there was no gathering. They didn't have, they were doing other things in, kind of building curriculum or practices around trauma-informed practices and principles. So these stories came out through a somewhat of a process, and then I put them together. So in collaboration with each of the individual stories, there was 10 stories made, all slightly different, and the relationship and how they write. And so a lot of that was evolved through a one-on-one dialogue with the storyteller. So that's another way of approaching it, where they are the art director. They are not necessarily the mechanics. That wasn't the intention of this workshop, was for them to learn how to make a digital story, but knowing that their story could be made into a digital story, and that they were with the process all the way through. They just didn't do the mechanics. So it's a kind of a collaborative design effort. And there's this whole work around collaborative design. And we do a lot of that work in our custom work, especially with like some of the women. We're doing, I don't do them, but Amy does it with women in Afghanistan. So just the whole language. So she has an array of illustrators, kind of like StoryCorps, where she will get these scripts beautifully recorded, work with them to tell the story they want to tell. And then have artists from the California College of Art, in particular, been working with them to find an honoring illustration presentation. So the production is done offsite, of course, and the storyteller is not just saying, and this is what we made, you approve? They're a part of the process as it's ongoing. So that's one way to get around, to some extent, how difficult it is to illustrate a digital story. I'll take the wrap if people think, why did you use that picture versus that? But for example, on this one, where Brenda's holding up her documentation of being part of that and getting, I can't remember, there's a kind of certification she has, so she is recognized as a standing member of that community and can get the services. But they, it was, the photo is there, but then we blurred out any of the sort of the specific details. So ethically not exposing her. Yes, there's a picture of her face, and it was decided to show pride in that person, to again center their disabilities or their but if you center it, it sort of disappears, especially in the context, at least for me, the slow pan of the encampment has a slightly different feel than if you're looking for bits and pieces that make it uncomfortable for people. So those are those ethical things that you can do in production and working with a storyteller and making decisions collaboratively. So even though that there's knowledge of the production all the way through, I think that was step number 2 or 3 in the guidelines. There's ways that you take a certain responsibility of the mechanics, and sometimes it's better actually that the story is beautifully told, is really important to see. But if they're trying to make it and they don't have the expertise, the visuals and the sound and the pacing don't work, and people dismiss it. And it's too amateurish, and people just disregard it because something else has gone. Now, as a facilitator, we know what that person has endured to make that story. But outside of the context of the workshop, people are just going to look at it at face value and say, well, why did they use that photo? And all of those things. So again, in the ethics of distribution, you're worrying about the well-being of that storyteller, and that their story is seen and heard in positive light rather than just having someone's aesthetic discounted. These are all things that need to be thought about when you sort of work in slightly different models.
I have a similar the story dissemination kind of like ethical issue that came up somewhat recently where a colleague of mine that we collaborate on a few story related works, had no issue with reaching backwards and using stories from people that have that either of us have worked with and incorporate them into like a presentation, but as a way of also selling, the storytelling work that we could do. And I had an issue with that. So I brought up that I didn't think that we could use these stories. We may have had permission, but I don't view the permission as like future going in all aspects of using their story. That in this case, yes, if we were the way that the story would be used as a way to instruct people in a webinar on storytelling, as an example, that the intention behind doing it all, though, was to drum up business. And so I had a problem with that use of it, because there was no way of us, aside from just giving thanks, we're not reimbursing the people who shared their stories for us. And so we had a discussion about it, and we had to change the way that we were doing things. And I realized that in a partnership like this, that yes, the ethical use of story for dissemination, and what kind of dissemination, what it means, and even if people give their permission, what does that mean? What is the length of time on that? What is the context for it? And then ultimately it came down to it didn't feel right to be using stories in a way that would also be used to promote the work that we could potentially do for other people.
Well, I mean, our consent form, and that one, I do have consent to use it, both because the idea of trauma-informed practice is the dominant, right? And, those stories, they take pride and ownership in what they're saying, how they're saying it. But if the consent is only around, in a particular focus of discussion and use, and it's being used outside of the context, that's unethical. There has to be, we're thinking of using, and I will reach out, and there may be some that didn't fill out the consent form about workshop and saying, would you mind, I'm doing a presentation on your story would be a wonderful example of conservation in rural Canada. And they'll say no, or typically yes, if there's a trust that's already been built. But that is right. And but that's a really important one. And if the consent was around the project, but now it's been used to promote the organization in a whole different way, especially if it's to drum up business, and there's that all of a sudden there's an appropriation and copyright and all that stuff. So
yeah, no, I think that part of the issue was that in the stories that we were thinking about, and one in particular, the partner felt very much that even though it wasn't that person's particularly, the person who helped create the story, it wasn't that person's story, the helper, right? The facilitator, it wasn't that person's story, but the facilitator was feeling, well, because I did all these prompts, that I guided this person in this way, I feel like part of this is a shared story. So I know that that kind of thinking was a way of making it ethical in that person's view of being able to use that story. So like it brought up a place of tension for us to talk about it. It allowed us to talk about, like how to go forward and everything. But I realized that both of us were working from a different framework of like how we were engaging with story. Yeah.
I know we're running up time. Thanks. Framework is important, and who's making that decision? The storyteller needs as much all that information to help guide their consent.
And I think partly what I hear what Janelle is saying is, does this person really know what they signed up for, even if they signed? And in issues or situations where there are benefits, are they aware of the benefits that somebody else is enjoying at the expense of their story?
let's watch one more. I know we're running out of time, and then we'll close out. It's a different story yet again about also a troubling issue from a person, and this is how the person dealt with it. This was done by a student at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health in Columbia University, and they had to tell stories about, you know, how they got involved in community health, or what does it mean to them? What does public health mean to them? And some of them are sort of, well, this came out of that.
Rob, your email
Oh,
is showing.
we're seeing a lot of your email.
Okay.
Really a lot of your email. I even saw my name up
Thank
there.
you. Boy. Now you can see it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to do this in YouTube because this is one,
Yes.
for some reason, it wouldn't allow me to embed it.
His eyes are not normal, oddly dilated and fixated sharply at me. I accidentally made eye contact with him while searching for a seat on the subway. My first mistake. As his mouth begins to move, I instinctually situate my body to face the opposite direction in an attempt to pretend I don't notice. This is my second mistake. He calls my bluff. Wow! Something about wet pussy, then multiple words which sound Italian, but I'm unsure. I increase my headphone volume to muffle his curses. In time he'll give up. They always do. The cheap aroma of masculine drugstore cologne wafting off him accentuates his creepiness. I march through the crowd, away from him. This is my third mistake. He aggressively follows. My train stop is now 3 away, and the man is becoming more belligerent. He says something again about pussy, and what are you gonna do about it? I look up and notice passengers staring at me. This is when I actually become scared. 5 grown, New York men are concerned for my safety and their own. I begin making eye contact with nearby passengers, pleading for help with my eyes. The person who appears to be the most disturbed by the man, other than me, is preoccupied keeping his girlfriend safe. He's not going to help me. But then, a man motions to stand next to him. So I do, quickly. He then says slowly and soberly, "You need to watch out for that man." There's now just one stop left until my own. This is when I finally face the creep. He is not tall, 5'4" at most. I could probably take him in a fight if I have to. But his pants are loose, and he has a bag. He could have a weapon. He's well dressed even, in a soprano sort of way. He's wearing a black suit, primary color red dress shirt, and matching pocket square. His black hair is chin length and partially greased back. The way he can't balance, and his large dark pupils, tell me he's very intoxicated. The creep then repeatedly taps his middle and index fingers together, making a rhythmic sound, as he says to the passenger who helped me, "Slap that pussy. Are you going to slap that pussy? What does it feel like? Wet? Is it warm? Or just lukewarm?" All 5 nearby men tell the creep to stop. He responds by pointing his right, middle, and index fingers at me, thumb up, then says, "Die," as he pretends to shoot me. The train stops. The passenger next to me encroaches toward the creep until he steps backward out of the train car. But he doesn't leave. He just enters the car in front of us. I get off the train at the next stop and pause to make sure the creep doesn't follow. He stays on the train, but as it pulls away, I see him harass passengers in his new train car.
All right. Let's take a moment. It's an intense story, and problematic. I shouldn't say from her perspective, but in screening it. And I know we're gone past the hour, and that's on me. We should unpack that a bit, or not, or carry the conversation after. Language, and that was interesting to watch the teacher of this class, not me, facilitator, and the head of the program, the dean or associate dean, right? And they ultimately let that go to stand as that story. Doesn't have trigger warnings. They are. The jury is out on trigger warnings, but that's, something to be discussed with project, and maybe in hindsight I should have mentioned the language in the context of that story. So that's maybe there's a discussion around that too.
I'm sorry, Rob, you were saying that there was tension with the funders or the school?
The school, I mean, they're public health. So these are graduate students and masters of health communication, public health communication. And so this is a required course. And through the process of the prompt, how does, what's your relation to public health? What drew you to public health? And so, but it was a pretty open, and so they would submit scripts, and, it was a whole, right. But just the language, it was such an intense interaction that was being recounted, of someone's lived experience as a way to set up the honoring that we got a problem. New York has a problem, and they wanted to, and their rationale is, don't talk about it, the problem, show the problem. Have us, in some ways, as close as you can be witness to that interaction that 71% of women in New York City have to deal with on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I could imagine that going up into certain circles of funders, and some say, well, we have to bleep that out. So the censorship of the experience and how to deal with that. So these are, I'm not saying, I have my personal view about freedom of that expression, but it also creates, does it turn people away from the story? Does it bring people into the story? Does it make people uncomfortable? With Abigail, she wanted uncomfortableness. She wants you to be uncomfortable, right? Because obviously she was very much so, and feeling that threat. So those kind of stories don't happen, but boy, when they happen, this is where having the expert in the room, deferring up, right? This was in a particular workshop that had different levels of authority and approval. But it was discussed with Abigail, and so it wasn't just like shock and awe, it was considered shock and awe. Janet, you haven't seen that before. So as a facilitator, what do you think in showing something like that?
I'm always at intention. What is the intention? I'm also very cautious about stereotypes, generalizations, and what implications that has for people who may not be directly involved in the dynamic of that story, but who get associated with some of the implications of what's being said. I get the shock and awe, but I also ask, at what expense? Were the stereotypes sitting in that? Some of the references, etc.
Janet, if she hadn't described what the person looked like, it's up to us then to imagine who that person would look like, right? I would say that could be even more dangerous because people are going to veer off one area possibly and think of one group of people, where I thought it was important that she, you know, and I don't live on the East Coast, I don't do New York City, but that story being told in Oakland, and if he hadn't shared, you know, like with that person, you know, the hair or the dress, that, and if that was left up to people's imaginations, Oakland would get the, oh, Oakland's a dangerous place, you know, like, oh, you know, like it's carjacking and all these bad things that happen in Oakland, and they would and blame it on a certain group of people, right?
Well, one group is, you know, substituting one group for another. You know, because in principle I have issues with any profile being held up as being implicitly physiologically more inclined to be one way than the other. Right. So you know, so that goes to my core. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Janelle, because now I recognize where it kind of hit. Yeah.
There, you know, there's the story, there's impact of that story beyond just the intention of Abigail wanting it to be visceral and raw and as close, like, I want you to be standing next to me, and to do that you need to, and arguably does the story carry that without the description? I guess you're talking about the pocket protector and the suit and the slick back hair, or is he drunk? I guess I'm not that we have to get into that about what the characterization as putting it as a kind of an identifiable group, because I'm not quite, other than being male, I'm not quite sure yet. That was never, I didn't sort of see the description as identifying as a group. I was too riveted about how the proximity of me to that, in the sense, right? So I think the reception of me as a male, the proximity of what would I do, right? I don't get that harassment, although 28% do. So she was very clear around certain sort of the context is where she loads up some of the context after the fact, which I think helps sort of frame the story a little bit, but you have to sort of live through the experience in her mind as close as she can get it. And I guess this is like, we don't often get a lot of stories that sort of bring us into that moment in that visceral way. Well, there's a lot of survivor stories in this sort of sense, and they'll use, you know, but not to that extent where you're just, it goes on. Like I kind of sometimes go, there's a moment about 2/3 and going, can this story end? Can it just, I think she said enough. Right. And that's my uncomfortableness. So I guess in some ways, when you get these stories that stretch both the sort of the language, the intent, this, you know, the insight and emotion, and find a moment, and, you know, and how do you see your story, and how do you hear your story? All of a sudden those become, they're all there, but we have to be prepared when someone comes in with a story that's kind of like, what do you do with that? And they're like, it's not like they're like sitting in trauma, they're sitting in defiance, and you know, they're a master's student in public health and going out to do, you know, work in making the public a safer, healthier place. You know, that's the argument, you know, that's what her goal would be, I would think, and this story says, coming from a lived experience. And not to, so I guess the just to close out the ethics in many, many years, and depending on how long you do it, right, is be prepared. And you just have to be prepared and learn and seek guidance and trust instincts. Don't be just an observer. You have to cross the line and be some kind of a collaborator. That, to me, if you're too passive, harm can be done. I don't think really any harm was done. All the students, it's also generational, all the students were sort of in awe and honor of Abigail telling that story.
Mhm.
Right. So there's a generational component. They live it differently than maybe me or you, or right, and how they so they saw it as a really important story. And I think that's sort of where Gina and Azur, who are the professors, deferred to the students on that. So and as a facilitator, I am only there if someone says, "What do you think, Rob?" And I think that, which they never did. There was never a decision for me to make on that.
Mm.
Right. I had to live with my uncomfortableness throughout it and let the negotiations happen amongst their peers and their superiors. And sometimes that's the place you got to be. And I think like facilitation doesn't mean taking the front, right? Especially that's why important to have others in the room of empowerment that have a higher respect and a bigger authority to deal with the university. And right, and there's other ones. There's been a few in that workshop because it's been the 5 years now. Right, one about harassment by a professor on campus. It's like, whoa, how do you deal with that? Now that one was not shared publicly, but it was important for that person to talk about it. No names mentioned, but it created this sort of issue around, and that was sort of Me Too movement. That's the world sometimes you deal with, not to scare people away, but they're always learning from me. It's like, whoa, and that was one. And then the language itself, like in YouTube, this doesn't go up right. It's a private listing, permission to share it in this context around ethics. But there's that YouTube not made for children, and the distribution and comments off, all of those things, the consideration, how you share that and how do you contextualize it. All right, we're 50 minutes past. I feel like that's a kind of heavy to go on. So let's find a different way to, and we didn't talk about your own stories.
Oh yeah, where are you on your
I
stories?
took a
Oh my
chance.
God, what time is this?
Yeah.
Oops, after 3, way after 3.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I sometimes take, there's the risk reward, and I think I might have taken a risk. I'm not sure what the reward. So just a couple of things to take away. I'll put these in, I'll make sure these are there. Now, these weren't to necessarily have today, but these are things to always think about and have discussions with your facilitation peers, your colleagues, the work that you're going to be doing with other people, work with your own self, like your own making. Right. Freedom of speech versus civility, privacy versus participation, advocacy versus safety, etc. And who's in charge of making those decisions? Here's my office hours. I don't think, did I put the right? Yeah. So I've got time tomorrow, time Tuesday and Wednesday. Monday is a holiday, obviously. I'll make sure that this goes out with the Zoom link, but it'll be the same as we've used here. And if you want to come in, talk about the story you're making for next week's screening, or you need to talk a bit more about, and certainly we can kind of email about today's session and questions. I'm sure there's as many questions more than there were answers. But I don't think I can emphasize enough the importance of the ethical considerations when you're doing storytelling, and that mistakes get made, including by seasoned facilitators. They need to be redressed.